There you go. Yeah, we're recording.
She's coming.
We are. Okay. All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another meeting of the DC Tax Revision Commission. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We've got several commissioners in the room. We've got several commissioners online as panelists prepared to engage in conversation on this really important topic, taxation and economic competitiveness. Our goal today is to learn from national and regional experts about what's driving local economic growth, with a particular focus on a few fast-growing cities, and to figure out how tax competition fits into that picture. Huge topic. We're not going to be able to answer every question related to that, but we thought it would be helpful to have a range of perspectives, particularly from the ground level, folks who can tell us what's working in specific communities and places around the country, in hopes that we can learn some lessons that might be relevant to our work in DC and on the Tax Commission. I'm going to go through today's session a little bit. I'll give you an overview of the agenda. But first, I want to remind everyone that we are, this is an expert briefing. We are taking a break, a 1-week break from our September and October job. Continue reviewing proposals. October 10th at 6:30, October 19th at 1 p.m., and October 24th at 6:30. They're all listed on the website and should be on commission members' calendars. On November 6th will be the opportunity for members of the public to weigh in on the proposals we've been reviewing. We'll be having a town hall right here at MLK Library. We'll be inviting anyone, DC residents and business leaders who want to speak to any or all of the proposals we've been reviewing. And then in the rest of November and into December, we have sessions scheduled to actually talk through what the package is going to look like. Today's topic, as I said, is taxation and economic competitiveness. Really excited about the speakers we have today. I'll introduce them in just a minute. They're each going to provide a bit of an overview from their very different perspectives. We're going to start with Richard Auxier, our consultant from the Urban Institute, who is going to ground us in a little bit of comparative data, comparing different jurisdictions around the country, both economic outcomes and some of the fiscal data, just to give us a little bit of a grounding. This is not a high-level data analysis. It's very difficult, as we've discussed before. It's really hard to compare jurisdiction data on its face, particularly when you're comparing very different localities. And hopefully we'll get into some of that, sort of what makes these places different, as well as what makes them comparable. So Richard's going to provide a quick data overview. Following that, I'm going to ask Pia to start the discussion, providing an overview of the performance of the Texas economy. We're then going to go to Jared to describe at a high level how DC compares to some other jurisdictions, and to talk about what his perspective on DC's tax system is competitive or non-competitive. And then we're going to go to Brian here in the room to provide an overview of how city strategists and economic development professionals think about competition between jurisdictions. I'm going to ask commissioners to hold their questions until Richard has had a chance to share some of the data with us, and till the presenters have had a chance to make their initial remarks. Then we're going to open it up for questions from commission members to the panelists. And we'll, as we've done in previous expert briefings, we'll focus on directing questions to the panelists for an hour or so. We'll try to wrap up that portion of the discussion by about 8, at which time we'll have an opportunity for commissioners to share their reflections on what they've just heard and what it means for our work, and aim to adjourn at 8:30. The speakers we have today, let me introduce them right now. Our first speaker is going to be Pia Orenius. She is a vice president and senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. She literally wrote the book on the Texas economy. And since two of the jurisdictions we were interested in are Austin and Dallas, we thought she'd be a great person to provide us some perspective of that. She's remote on your screen from Dallas. And I think, Pia, you're going to have some slides that you're going to present from your screen. Is that right? You don't have to put them up yet, but yes. We will also post those on the commission website after the event. But for this presentation, you'll be sharing them. Then we're going to go to Jared, who is here in DC, but currently on the road, joining us live from. Are you in Salt Lake? Is that right? Is that what I remember?
Yes, that's correct.
So great. So we will then have Jared. So Jared Walczak is Vice President of State Projects at the Tax Foundation, which is a noted nationwide research institute focusing on Texas. And then here in the room with us at the MLK Library, we have Brian Kelsey, who is Manager for Economic Development Advisory Services at Ernst & Young, and he's a former Chief Strategy Officer with the City of Nashville, and he'll provide the economic development professional perspective. Let me ask commissioners if they have any questions about any of what I've just rattled off before we dive in.
Let me, as chairman, thank the panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to inform the commission. Competitiveness and economic attractiveness is a big part of our discussion and a big part of our mission. So we really appreciate you briefing us today. Thank you very much.
Okay, so to frame the discussion a little bit, before I turn to Pia, I'm going to let Richard talk us through some data that he has pulled together.
Awesome, thanks, Nick. And to emphasize, this is a little bit of data. It's very broad data. It's table setting. I just want to give you guys hopefully some data and some language to help you talk through it. But I'm going to go quickly because we have some actual experts who can answer your actual questions about all this and how it relates to tax policy. While it is going to be brief, by the way, just quickly, I'm going to go over these charts and data. Nick should have emailed these all to you if you want to peruse them when you get back home. And if you have any follow-up questions about any of this, please feel free to email me directly, and I can get you more data, longer time series data, or breakout. It's all in graphs, and I can provide you with if any of that is helpful to you. While I'm going to go quick, it did take a minute to put this all together, and I want to briefly thank my colleagues at Urban, Muskanja, Gabby Garita, and Luisa Godinez-Puig for helping me assemble all this. Okay, I'm going to go over just a few topics: population, labor force, income, housing, unemployment, and property. Population. If we look at data from 2010 to 2019, the district's population related to the other cities that I'm looking at right now, those cities are Austin, Charlotte, Dallas, Miami, and Nashville. And it'll be those 6 cities, including the district, in all of these comparisons, was middle of the pack. It was 15.5% growth from 2010 to 2019. That was roughly on par with Miami. It was behind Austin, which had the strongest growth at 22%, but ahead of Nashville, which only had 10.6% growth. If we look at population since the pandemic, 2020 to 2022, which is a different data set, that's why you have to split it, the district's population is relatively flat, 0.1% since the pandemic. Now that's below Charlotte, which saw 2.5% growth in that period, but it's ahead of Nashville and Dallas, which both saw population declines. So population, broadly speaking, middle of the pack among our comparative cities. It's a different picture if you look at labor force. Although quick qualifier, to do this comparison, we have to look at metro data. They don't break it down specifically by city. So it's the entire metro region. If we look at the metro region, the district has, the second lowest labor force growth behind Miami. And it's significantly lower than cities like Austin and Dallas that have seen very strong labor growth since 2011. We do have city level for the district because census treats the district as a state, and so they produce that data. And you can see that since 2019, you've seen a decline in its labor force growth, sharp downward signal. If we look at median household income, which is for this, it's going to be the district versus these counties. Again, apologies, but it's very hard to do apples to apples with this, and we have to use different data sets. If you look at median household income, this is an example of some things are just what I would say are baked into different places. The district has the highest median household income of any of these 6 cities and has since unemployment related to these other places. It had the second highest unemployment in 2011, and it has the highest unemployment among these cities in 2020-21. Again, policy affects these, things happen, but a lot of this is the district is a city with a lot of high-income people, which brings up its median household income, and a city with some concentrated poverty, which brings up its unemployment rate relative to some of these other cities. If you look at child poverty levels, which I need to stress is child poverty before tax policy credits and other cash programs like Medicaid, you'll see that the district is roughly the middle of the pack. But if you had this graph in front of you, you would again see that these cities are kind of on a stable trajectory because this is one of these things which is just kind of a characteristic of the city. However, again, this is a measurement of before policy, and it is worth noting that the District of Columbia has an expansive Medicaid program, has the most generous earned income tax program, whereas none of these other cities are in states that offer an earned income tax credit, and none of them currently offer a Medicaid expansion. Charlotte will have it soon, as North Carolina just recently adopted it. On housing, the district has seen the slowest housing growth of any of these. You see far stronger growth in cities like Miami and Dallas since 2011, but it's worth noting that the district had the highest home prices going into it. And so it still has relatively high prices, but you've just seen this incredible growth. Again, that one looks a little bit more like the labor force, where you've seen these other 5 cities see really strong growth and the district kind of lags behind. And then at the back, I have some just notes on how the district, again, is, compares to these cities in terms of its government, its property sources. As I've explained before, DC is unique. It's both a city and a state. It levies all taxes. These places only typically levy property taxes and collect from charges. Some notable differences there. And then similarly on spending, the district spends on public schools, Medicaid, police, fire, hospitals, everything. Whereas in these cities, you mostly see spending concentrated among police and fire departments because other governments are picking up that tab and providing those services. And then finally, I also think it's worth noting that, we talk a lot about Congress and they're clearly an obstacle to what the district can do. But a lot of these other cities also face significant challenges running their government because their states have enacted preemption laws that restrict the property. For example, Charlotte is limited in the property tax it can limit. Austin and Dallas are restricted in both the property tax rate and in the just total levy and the assessment value. And so the district has a far bigger toolkit of addressing problems than these other places because they have a smaller government and because they are under their states, which in fact control a lot of the laws they levy. So I know that was quick. I'm happy to answer any questions about this. Hope it was helpful. But then we also have experts who are going to weigh in, hopefully give you some more depth.
I just want to flag online, thank you, Richard, for that comprehensive data. These data sets will be posted on the TR website, and commissioners should have them in their inbox if you haven't seen them yet. Just want to flag, I know folks online, so I'm sorry about our connection trouble. It sounds like we cut out for about a minute, so I apologize. And hopefully, if you have any key questions, you can follow up in the Q&A portion with Richard. Let me turn now to PIA. So a little background. I think I skipped past the part where it was like, well, why are we talking about these particular locations? These were locations that we identified in conversations with commissioners as being of interest. These are some of the cities that we're talking about are the cities that make a lot of headlines for being fast-growing cities, particularly in places where the housing market's under a lot of pressure, where unemployment's really low. Clearly, there's a lot of labor force growth. Exciting things seem to be happening in these cities when we look at it from our vantage point here miles and miles away. So we're excited to have both Pia and Brian here to give us a little bit of the ground level view of what does it feel like and look like a little closer, up close and personal. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Pia, to share your thoughts on what's going on in the Texas economy and in particular some of the cities there.
Great, thank you so much. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yep, we hear you great.
Great, and you can see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great pleasure. I thought I would share the work that we did, and it's been updated, but we did this work for the Dallas Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas Centennial. So in 2014, we had a conference, and then we published the papers in a book, and we called it the 10-Gallon Economy. And it's really about the outsized growth, what accounts for the job growth premium and the output growth premium in Texas. And I know you guys are more interested in cities than states, but I would say that in terms of Austin and Dallas, a lot of what I'm going to say for the state is true of Austin and Dallas, which really have driven a lot of the growth in the state, at least in the more recent decades. So first, let me just show some of this outsized growth. So this is GDP growth, real GDP growth compared, Texas to the rest of the U.S. And you can just see that not in the 1980s, which were a bad time for the state, just because it was an oil-based economy, several oil shocks and recessions and a banking crisis. But by the mid-1990s, Texas economy was diversifying and its cities were diversifying. Austin was growing in particularly very quickly, and Dallas as well. And so really that's when output growth in the state started taking off and really differentiating itself from the rest of the U.S. You see a similar pattern when you look at job growth. So this is employment growth, and you can see again how this job growth premium in the state just accumulates over time. And it's been growing about, in terms of job growth, about 1.5 times the rate of the U.S. without Texas. And so you can just see this outperformance of job growth is also would be true for Dallas and Austin. More recently, also Fort Worth and San Antonio is also doing well. Houston is the one city that we have that, because of its traditional energy base, is growing a little bit more slowly than the state average. Here you can see, I wanted to make the point first and foremost that Texas job growth, the premium, the fact that we grow, about a percentage point faster than the nation, which is typically, almost twice as fast as the nation in terms of employment creation, that's really driven by net in-migration of workers. And so these bars are showing you net in-migration, both of domestic in black and international migration in gray. And you can just see over time, the average here is about 220,000 per year net in migration, so that's in minus out. And you can also see this amazing standout in 2022. This net migration reached 350,000, which is just unheard of. So that was a record in migration into the state. Just the fact that domestic migration picked up in the pandemic here, and as you can see by the size of those black bars in 2020, 2021, and 2022, that was surprising to everybody. But there's been stuff written on this, and it's related to work from home, obviously, and also some of the other growth factors in the region. So one criticism that we got when we started talking about, there's a lot of employment and job creation in Texas, the first thing that we got pushback on was that this job creation is just minimum wage jobs. So we took that question to the data and we looked at job creation by wage quartile. So in this chart, I'm showing you the different wage quartiles. So the lowest wage quartile is jobs that pay, 10 to 11.50 dollars per hour in Texas, and a little bit higher for the U.S. And so forth. By these quartiles, you can see that actually there's more growth in every quartile for Texas as compared to the U.S. So it's not true that the job growth premium is just creating jobs at the minimum wage. what are these drivers of regional growth exactly? So what in this book that we wrote, we had to really go through and scour the literature on what drives the regional growth. And first and foremost, it's industry mix in the sense that Texas has, of course, energy, which it's a boom bust industry, but it has been booming more than busting. So that's been on net a plus for the region. And cities have the same construction of industry mix. So Austin, of course, which very early on in the 60s specialized in high-tech manufacturing and high-tech services, from then on had this job growth premium and output growth premium built in the sense that they were so vested in the high-tech industry. The business climate is extremely important in terms of attracting firms and investment. This is not just taxes. We don't have a corporate income tax in Texas. It's also regulation and land usage, all kinds of related factors that firms consider when expanding in a state or when moving to a state, or a city rather. So business climate is very important. Workforce and education are also, you're not going to bring in any firms, and firms are not going to expand in your city if you don't have ample workforce and a properly trained and educated workforce. So that's another significant factor. Cost of living, of course, matters, as does the tax burden. And so there's several studies that show this correlation with mobility in terms of where people and firms move based on housing costs, transportation costs, and the tax burden. And of course, in Texas, we don't have a state income tax, but we do have, property taxes and sales taxes, and of course, other fees. Companies don't have an income tax, but they have a franchise tax. Weather. So I don't want to say more about that, but mild weather in the studies, in the research, is shown to be, bring more migration, more growth. Secondary factor. So if you have a lot of growth, you can also bring in migration. And so I wanted to put this in a second category just because this, you're not going to have in-migration if you're not growing. But if you have in-migration when you're growing, you're going to grow even faster. So this is an endogenous driver of growth. And so I put here in-migration. Texas is typically number 1 or number 2 in terms of in-migration of workers and firms. Not necessarily in terms of rate because of the size of the state, but always top 5, top 10 on these measures. The other consideration for migration is not just bringing people in, but retaining the people and the firms and the investment that come in. So retention of those. So low out migration, high in migration are ideal for growth. What are the select takeaways really from the Texas case? And I'll finish with this slide because I know I just had very little time left. So I want to just make a few points and then we can discuss these later. So the labor market is less regulated in Texas, of course, but in the work that we've done on some aspects of this, it actually has had some benefits for workers. For example, we have less part-time work and more full-time work that if you compare to other states like California, that has a more regulated labor market. So that's actually one benefit. Of course, one controversy that's arisen more recently in the state is that the state and the cities are disagreeing over, local control of labor market regulation. Education outcomes in the state are good relative to cost. Really, there's not a lot of education spending relative to the national average. And so if the education outcomes are around the national average, then that's pretty good relative to cost. But of course, this is something that really needs to be better. Infrastructure grows with the population. That's really another important aspect of growth in this region. So whether it's permitting, zoning, regulation to allow more construction, private-public partnerships, toll roads, the state excels at these. The cities, however, they tend to do a little bit worse in this dimension. They tend to lose to the suburbs, and that's sort of a repeated story here in Texas as it is, I think, across the nation in many cases. The electric grid is a whole nother conversation. We can cover that in Q&A. I did want to mention a growing pain for the state is because there is no state income tax, so relying on property taxes has not been a problem as long as housing prices really didn't go up for a long time. 80s, 90s, really into the 2000s, housing values were pretty flat in Texas just because there was so much building in and around our metropolitan areas that housing values did not appreciate, so property taxes did not go up much. But lately, of course, in the last 10 years or so, property taxes and in the pandemic, they've gone up a lot. And so this has really become a pain point for the state and for the cities. And so property taxes coming this fall, we think, but that's only because the state has a surplus. If there was no surplus, we would still be stuck with these property tax bills. And lastly, there is a safety net with holes. If you have less taxes, you also have less spending on social services. And we do have the highest uninsured rate in the nation. And it's, of course, worse in the cities than it is in suburbs and as compared to the cities. And that was sort of the introduction that I had. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Pia. I really appreciate that overview of Texas. And I know lots of folks are going to have questions for you in a moment, and we will get to that. But I want to turn now to Jared to describe, again, at a high level, how DC compares to some of these other jurisdictions that we've been talking about, not just Austin and Dallas that Pia's been talking about, but places like the Charlottes and Miamis and Nashville's. How do you see how do you even approach the challenge of comparing DC to these very different places? To what extent do you see these tax systems competitive, non-competitive? And how do you think outcomes would be different if DC adjusted some of its tax policies? That's a lot of questions to answer, and I know I've only given you a few minutes. If you can scratch the surface, I'm sure we'll have lots of questions to dig a little more deeply into some of them.
Well, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. You're meeting four blocks from my office, so I'm sorry that I'm not there with you in person, but I was speaking at the Federation of Tax Administrators Conference today and couldn't get back in time, so thanks for letting me do this remotely. I do want to talk about competitiveness and the trade-offs associated with all of this, because unfortunately, pretty much all of policy is about trade-offs. And we know that at either extreme on taxes and government spending, it doesn't really work. You could have almost no taxes and no government spending, and of course that would be a highly uncompetitive place that wouldn't attract individuals, it wouldn't attract businesses, it wouldn't attract investment. We have seen that. You can be very high and focus on the trade-off of trying to provide for more equity, more transfers, but undermine some of those goals by creating less economic dynamism. And I unfortunately think that DC, as a lot of these discussions have unfolded, is leaning more in that direction, especially given the changes in how people work. Obviously, every state, every jurisdiction is dealing with what it looks like to have hybrid and remote work, to have the telework that has just changed a lot of the landscape. But DC has been hit harder than most, partly because it's a small jurisdiction where it's very easy to live in Virginia or Maryland, partly because, of course, DC by federal law is not able to tax non-resident income. So people who live in those states can easily avoid paying DC income taxes. And of course, when this happens and when people are working less in the district, it's not just that their income's not being taxed there, but there's also a drying up of the service economy with workers downtown who do live in the district because people aren't there to go to the restaurants, to use some of the services in the city. Hopefully, the return to office plan on federal employment will take place and will help alleviate some of this issue, but we know these are significant. Pia talked a little about the degree to which there are a lot of things that affect both businesses and individuals in location decisions and investment. You care about a qualified workforce, you care about agglomeration effects, the unique job landscape, and the federal government is a big part of that, both directly and indirectly for DC. Quality of life, cost of living, and taxes. And taxes are far from the whole picture. They are something you can control, but also when you are DC, when you have this unique situation, they are something that becomes much more salient because you just have to cross a river to make a significant difference in your tax liability. And that could be even more the case if some of the things that have been up for discussion were employed. You don't have to change your job. You don't have to change all of your personal networks. You just have to maybe have a slightly longer commute, that maybe you're only going in once, twice, or 3 times a week. So these things really do matter. And of course, there's a looming risk factor, and that's what commercial real estate looks like in lots of cities, but certainly in DC, where I believe that about 84% of all property taxes in DC come from commercial. Now, that includes rental properties. So some of the rental properties aren't going to be affected, but that's really significant when you think about just what the occupancy rate on commercial property is. So that is a real risk. But DC spends over $25,000 per capita. And of course, you can't just do a state comparison because you have state and local expenditures elsewhere. But New York is under 16,000. California is under 15,000. The national average is 11,087. 41 states spend less than half of the DC per capita. And that's state and local. It's not just state. 41 are less than half. So when we talk about what are the trade-offs, I worry, especially when we think about some of the new taxes that have been discussed, whether it's digital taxes, business activity taxes, or gross receipts taxes, per employee fees, which you could avoid by working remotely or having satellite offices. Some of these other proposals, they are really leaning into potentially driving more high net worth individuals who have a lot more flexibility and businesses to locate just outside of the district. And while those are the people who have the flexibility, the people who are often hurt are going to be those who are going to stay in the district, who are relying not just on the social safety nets, which are really important, but they also, of course, want the jobs. They want the opportunities. They want the ability to not require as much of that social safety net. And when you look at some of the numbers that Richard put out there, and maybe bringing some of those a little more up to date, you just look at, say, the last decade, and you see some, I think, really concerning trends. Obviously, DC has the second highest unemployment rate in the country. And other states that are way up there are California, New Jersey, Illinois. There's sort of some similar policies in there. There is an interesting outlier. Texas is actually up there too. I'm going to put a caveat there, though. You can have a higher than average unemployment rate because people are moving in and looking for jobs and staying when they lose them rather than going somewhere else. Or you can have it because people don't have the opportunities. And you might say I'm cherry picking, I'm finding an excuse for Texas. But here's the numbers. In the last 10 years, high unemployment rates in Texas compared to a lot of states, but in the last 10 years, DC employment totals, number of people employed in the workforce, it's up 3.9%. In Texas, it's up 20.1%, more than 6 times more. These are real issues. So DC, I think, has to be very careful here. Rates are higher than in the surrounding jurisdictions. There are some policies that I think are fairly detrimental to business investment, which is really going to matter. You have no first-year expensing. You tax guilty, which most states do not. You have a throwback rule. You obviously have a higher than average corporate rate, a much higher than average individual income tax rate, which affects pass-through businesses. A lot of businesses in DC are pass-through. And not only is that just generally true that in numbers, in most states, that's most of them, but in terms of revenue, it's higher than average in DC. Split rule for property tax. Commercial pays about 2.1 times what residential does. There's a state tax. There's a transaction-based safe harbor under the Wayfair provisions. There's no exemptions for tangible personal property tax at a low level. These are all things that affect businesses deciding whether to invest in the district. Some of them affect whether individuals want to live in the district when they can live elsewhere. You have an enormous advantage, locked in, built-in advantage that the federal government is here. So a lot of jobs have to be here either because they're federal employees or because they're contractors or in some way associated with the work of the federal government. In the same way that, New York's financial sector, California's tech sector, there's huge positive effects that can really help deal with maybe high taxes, high cost of living. Take taxes away for a second. I mean, because people debate, do taxes affect decision making? Take a jurisdiction like DC or like New York City. We know it's way more costly to live there. People are still willing to live there because there's something important that it's offering, but that doesn't mean that cost of living doesn't matter, that you wouldn't prefer to have a lower cost of living, that more people wouldn't want to be there or could afford to be there. It's the same with taxes. And DC's big challenge, as all of this is considered, is that you can be, I'm sorry to say, like me. I live in Arlington, and I'm sorry. I apologize. There are a lot of reasons, and it's not just taxes, but honestly, it does make a difference, and it makes a lot of difference for a lot of people who make more than I do. It makes way more difference for them, and when they leave, you can say good riddance, if they don't want us, whatever, but they're paying for all those services that you do in fact need to provide. So just the word of caution, the word of trade-offs really do matter in all of this.
Thanks, Jared. Thanks so much for providing that national context. Finally, I'm going to turn it over to Brian here in the room to talk a little bit from the perspective of someone who's worked on strategy at the local level as in city management and in economic development. How have you thought about competition among localities, and where do taxes fit into that picture?
Thanks. Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for the opportunity to come and hang out with you for a little bit this evening. So I do work at Ernst & Young. I am part of the economic development practice. And as we get into the discussion, I'll be glad to talk about sort of how that world thinks about these things, whether it's advising companies on location decisions or it's advising cities and counties and economic development organizations on strategy. So I'll be happy to do that. But I think the perspective that Nick wanted me to bring to this discussion is somebody who's been on the other side of the table, working for municipalities. I joined Ernst & Young last year after working most of my career in the public sector. So I was the chief strategy officer, which in Nashville, which is basically a city management type position under 2 mayors. I lived and worked in economic development in Austin for about 15 years. And now I live in the DFW area in Arlington. So I've got some firsthand experience on the public sector side of the table and dealing with these things. And I think what I want to use my probably 5.5 minutes left to say, and it's not so much a contrarian view on information that's been provided on these other places, but there are some really important differences in these markets that you're looking at and using as comparisons. So I just want to walk through, and so I promised Nick I wouldn't bring slides, so I kept my promise. I did not do slides, but I couldn't help myself, so I pulled some data. And so, I want to just quickly walk through a couple of these things to keep in mind. The first is just basically the size of these cities, right? So according to, I have lived in DC briefly, but we were all still using Blackberries back then, so it's been quite a while. But according to the census, DC is roughly 60 square miles. Does that sound more or less correct? So 60 square miles. Let's take Nashville as an example. Nashville is a metropolitan government. It's a consolidated city-county jurisdiction. Anybody want to take a guess on how big geographically Nashville is? It's almost 500 square miles, right? So keep in mind when you're comparing DC to a place like Nashville, it's 500 square miles, right? Dallas, 340 square miles, Austin, 320, Charlotte, 308. Like the only one you were really pretty close to is Miami in terms of land area size. So when we start to think about things like population density, housing density, and you look at the market here and you've got about, let's call it 5,800 housing units per square mile. In Nashville, that's 665. So these are this is an important difference when we start talking about things like tax policy and even just economic development. So that's number one. Number two is housing prices. So you alluded to this, but let me just put some numbers to this. And people can quibble about the right source to look for the most current asking price in the market, but I'm going to use the Zillow's latest median value. So median value, this is across all housing types. So condos, detached, single family, right? They've got your median at about $620,000 right now. Does that sound reasonable citywide? In Dallas, it's 310. In Nashville, it's 431. And in Austin, which has seen more price escalation than any of these markets over the last 10 years, it's still only 555. So while some of these markets are starting to creep up close to parity, these are, from a cost of living perspective, and we're going to talk about what attracts people and companies in certain places, these are huge fundamental differences in these markets, right? I also want to talk about the income side for a second. So if you look at all these peer markets you're using here, there's been a lot of wealth creation, both organically and people moving to places like Austin. So here's just one way to look at that. So if I go back about 10 years, these are cities. So I'm not talking metro areas right now, I'm talking cities. So if you go back about 10 years, and you look at all the households, and you break out the households at the very top of the income ladder, it's like $200,000 or more. In Austin, that was about 5% of households years ago. Now, it's about 17%. So it's tripled in 10 years. DC, 10 years ago, you were at 11%. So you were double Austin's rate, right? And you've grown to 24%. So 1 out of 4 households here, $200,000 or more in household income. So that's sort of key difference number 2. Number 3 is the drivers, and Pia touched on this a little bit, so I'm hoping she'll say more about this. But the industry drivers there's some important differences in these markets, right? And that translates to differences in the growth rates too, in terms of total economic growth, not just employment, but just looking at total GDP, right, of the regions. So you've grown, and I had to get up to the metro level here because we don't really have comparable statistics here. But your GDP for the metro area economy here in the last 10 years has grown by about 15%. So that's pretty good, actually. I mean, that's not bad. I'm not an economist. I think people would agree that that's not bad. Austin, and this is real GDP growth, right? This is inflation-adjusted GDP growth. Austin, 70%. 70%. Right? If you go to Nashville, 50%. So all these markets are growing at a fairly good rate, but some of these markets are really kind of outliers. There's some important trends there that you have to understand. In addition to the industry drivers, tech. Most of these markets have a tech industry component to them that drives the economies. But something like Nashville still is driven largely by healthcare. So some of the largest healthcare companies in North America are based in Nashville. Obviously, music. 100,000 employees in the music industry in Nashville, right? So those differences are important, I think, as we start to talk about, what we want to make of these comparisons here. Last one, disparity in equity. So I pulled average earnings data for white workers and black workers and compared average earnings per month. And the interesting thing here is, I found it interesting. So on average, black workers in the district make about what white workers make in some of these other markets, which was interesting. And you have a much higher income workforce here on average than some of these other places. But your gap is larger between white workers and black workers. So on average, it's black workers here make about 57% average white workers. It's about $6,200 a month, and for white workers, it's about $10,009. Let's call it $11,000 a month. So that gap's about 57% black-white ratio. And in the other markets, so Austin 70%, Nashville 67%. So the gap in earnings here is quite a bit larger, even though the wage differences are skewed higher here compared to some of these other markets. So I mean, these are all very important contextual issues I think you need to keep in mind as we kind of debate. And by all means, learn what you can. So that's when I said this is not really a contrarian view, right? I mean, there are important things to learn from these markets, but it's equally important to keep in mind how fundamentally different these places are, I think, in a lot of ways.
Thank you, Brian. And thank you again, Pia. Thank you again, Jared. I want to open it up to questions from commissioners, but Brian, let me just circle back to you on one thing, because you didn't talk about as you talked about the comparisons, and just maybe you could spend a few words talking about, from your perspective as someone who consults with both firms and governments, and given your public sector background, how do you think about, on a firm-by-firm basis, how do you think about tax competition versus the other decisions that both individuals and firms make in terms of location?
So taxes matter. The extent to which they matter, we can argue about, but anybody who tells you that taxes don't matter, he or she has not really sat in a room. And whether it's you're trying to recruit a company, or a company is trying to grow locally versus a decision to move elsewhere, that it's very real and it matters. The question is, how much does it matter and when does it matter? And so let's take the company side of this. first, right? I mean, the way this process usually works, and again, this is a different market here. You've got different target industries, right? We're not citing, enormous $10 billion semiconductor manufacturing projects in DC. Like that's just not a thing that's happening, right? So the way it typically would work is in one of those location decision processes, the firm or their consultants would narrow it down nationally to maybe a handful of places. And it's typically different states. It's typically different states in a certain region of the country, but in some unique cases, it can be states that are a little bit spread out. But if you kind of rank order the selection factors, taxes are not first. What would you guess is going to be the number one thing? So what's related to education in terms of stuff, company? Exactly. So workforce availability by far is the number one important site location factor. If you don't have the workforce to fill the jobs that companies create, you are never going to, I don't care if your taxes are zero, if you're never going to get to that handful of contenders for a project. So yeah, taxes are important, they're in the rank order, right? But they are not, it's not the number one factor among all factors.
Thank you. Okay, as promised, I will now open it up to questions from commissioners for Brian. I see Mayor Williams has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, so question for the last speaker. Talk about, I was going to say size matters, that's not good. Why, it's a family commission. Talk about how geographic scale matters. You talked about, how much bigger Austin, Charlotte are, why is that significant?
Well, so it matters for it's a good question. It matters for a couple different reasons. One, labor markets are regional. And a couple of the other speakers pointed this as well. Labor market lines don't stop at city limits. They don't stop at county boundaries. Labor markets are regional, and people and companies have choices about where to locate within a region. In some places that can be very different. So, the urban Austin is much different than less urban, but quickly urbanizing Williamson County to the north or Hayes County to the south. That's all one labor market. But from even an economic development policy, Austin can have much different goals, much different tax incentives, just a much different philosophy to economic development than if you drive 15 miles in one direction or the other. So it matters very much in that way, because in a place like Texas, even once, let's say a company is evaluating a region, even once they've made the decision to go to a region, there is still a lot of local competition within that region, among usually the central city and a lot of the outlying cities competing for that project. So those differences are important.
Thank you.
And just to piggyback on the mayor, the size, Mayor, it seems to me that land would give you an opportunity to develop. And so if I'm looking at Fort Worth, and Pia, you can please correct me if I'm wrong, but Fort Worth is being driven a lot by infrastructure, a Perot airport. And that airport has then, in its central location, the workforce has led to Google and Amazon fulfillment centers. And so, because they have the land and they have a favorable environment, it's like poof, you have instant economy in Fort Worth that didn't exist 10 years ago. But what I wanted to ask is, if any of you can give us some help on the challenge that we are facing. We have a good revenue projection. Thank you, Mr. CFO. Things are not as bad as we had thought. They're better than we had hoped. Things are flat, not decreasing, but we're still looking at downtown buildings that are 60% of their assessed value pre-COVID, many of which have notes coming due. And what I'm thinking, I'm trying to put myself, in a place where Mayor Williams was and where Mayor Bowser is right now. That is, how do I attract capital to this city at this point to invest in those notes, to invest in the conversions? What is my message to whoever has money at an era of high interest rates, crime that is frankly beyond where we want it to be, and what looks like a headwind of legislative priorities to tax and spend, just to be honest. Is there a blueprint? Can someone tell us what we might want to assemble to help us, reverse this, what I think of as a train wreck? Buildings being given back to banks, declining retail, deteriorating downtown, rolling blackouts, more crime, et cetera. Is there a blueprint?
Pia, why don't we start with you and then go to Jared and then Brian?
So, not an expert in this area, but I would say the magic of cities, and that has to be true of DC as well, is industry clusters, right? Is these and the fact that when industries cluster, they are more productive, and wages go up, and there's more investment. So I would think one strategy would be, and certainly this has been the case, in Dallas, we've seen in Austin, we've seen the agglomeration industries and the agglomeration effect of these clustered industries bring more growth and more investment. And so, if you can identify of course, the federal government is probably the biggest industry cluster in DC, but if you can identify what are cluster industries, and then I don't know, maybe maybe Jared knows better in terms of what incentives can be put in place to attract investments to grow these clusters, because I think really what the literature finds is that these industry clusters, they become, self-enforcing, and they can really be the secret sauce to growing a city.
Let me follow up on David's question. If you have this building and you're talking about readaptive uses, one of the uses we're talking about is residential use. Well, put that to the side. What other readaptive uses would you aim toward to use existing infrastructure? We have 660 square miles of here in Nashville, 500 other places. So within that 60 square mile, there's only so much you're going to be able to do. So if you're talking about readaptive uses, and let's just put housing to the side, what other kind of readaptive uses would you think about?
I can chime in.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead on that, and also if you have other thoughts on the rest of David's question, and then we'll go to you, Jared, if that's okay.
So every city is struggling with this right now. I mean, we work with about 300 communities across the United States, and this is the first. This is one of the first questions, right? I don't know that I would completely cast aside the residential conversion question, because that's an important one. You should probably, I'm sure it's come up before in these meetings. But other uses, it's tricky. It's the problems with residential conversions too, because you have to find something that is going to provide the same kind of income stream to serve the node, right, than for other things. But when you think about things you may want to incentivize in some way, right, from a policy perspective, economic development, especially for places like DC, is about attracting people. You want to be a place where creative, enterprising people have space to be creative and enterprising. And while I'm not going to I'm not going to highlight any one particular model for shared use space, there are a lot of really interesting things happening in other cities. And there's one community we're working with right now that is using childcare, highly subsidized childcare, as a workforce development strategy. So we're talking a company working with state and local officials to try to increase the retention rate for their workers and even draw more people into their workforce. And they're providing on-site childcare as a way to do that. There are other examples like that, but again, the challenge is from the property owner's perspective, what can you do from the policy side to even come close to the return they were getting, pre-pandemic? So there are no, and I mean, I'd answer your question kind of in the same sort of unsatisfactory way. There is no blueprint. for this. There are interesting examples of cities doing things, but nobody has figured this out as a city yet.
Nick, can I just follow up? But I would welcome any of our presenters to present or to give us their thoughts after this meeting about, if you are the mayor and you are trying to be a salesperson for this city with all that we have going on with interest rates and declining values and so on, and with a population that is at best level, what tools does she need to attract capital to the city and to reassure investors that this is a good investment for them? And I don't know if there are any uses of the retail space, first floor. I really like that idea of incentivizing daycare in place of as a temporary pop-up for infill for retail. It just makes sense, all right. And the incentives you would give the property owners would be negotiated through decreased rate or whatever. But have you ever seen a state use its accumulated reserves, perhaps, to illustrate its willingness to invest in itself? This city has $1 billion+, not all of which is liquid, but much of it is in New York. Why wouldn't we be signaling to Wall Street and other investors that we're willing to invest in our own conversions, we're willing to invest in this, come be a partner with us?
Jared, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, maybe I'll try to take two of those pieces to the question about the commercial real estate now and that massive footprint that is somewhat substantially unoccupied right now. We said put aside conversion to residential, and obviously that is going to be part of it. But you have that central core, and it's just you have to have windows. You have to there's just limits on a lot of these buildings what you can do there. Frankly, getting people back into offices and filling that up has to be part of it. There's just only so many things you can convert that to if you do not have workers downtown. You can't give up on the idea that you need to get more workers downtown. You need more investment downtown. And right now, I don't think the tax code is optimized towards that. The tax code is far from the only thing that is driving this, but the tax code is not optimized towards it. Not only is there obviously a very high, there's a high corporate rate. There's very high individual rates. So for a lot of these S corps, pass-throughs, partnerships are a huge deal in DC. It is more expensive to be there, but also just the structure. Capital investment is penalized more in DC than in the surrounding jurisdictions. That's not the intention. I don't think anyone wakes up and says, let's create a tax code that penalizes capital investment. But when you have no first-year expensing, when you do conform to the interest limitation, when you have a lot of limitations, just how you depreciate and deduct capital, when you have a tangible personal property tax that has no threshold whatsoever. You could be a sole prop and have a computer, and you've got to pay on that. And there's no real revenue that the city's generating out of that. But it's a compliance burden. Some jurisdictions have some de minimis exemptions so that it's a little easier for smaller businesses to actually not have to comply with something that raises almost no revenue. Basically, you have a tax structure that's saying it's going to be more of a hassle to invest, do capital investment, and to bring people downtown. Some of these, there are revenue implications. Some of them, the revenue implications are pretty modest or almost non-existent, and yet they're still biased against bringing people back downtown. I think that's a real concern. You have to be able to reverse this. When you do have this competition. So, we heard the conversation earlier from Brian about, the much larger jurisdictions. And one aspect of large versus small, going back to what I was talking about earlier, is that when we think about all of the effects other than taxes, like qualified workforce, you really have to think of qualified workforce as a larger MSA issue. It's not DC, it's DC, Northern Virginia, parts of Maryland. And therefore, your taxes are more salient than they are in a jurisdiction where you can't leave the area and still be part of that agglomeration effect. You can go to Virginia, you can go to Maryland. You have to focus more on competitiveness. That doesn't mean you need to be low tax. You can have higher than average taxes and still be competitive because DC does have great things to offer. And because, the federal government being here is hugely important. You're not going to be Florida. You're not going to be Texas. You're going to have an individual income tax. The goal is not to, get rid of all of these taxes. It's to be within a broadly competitive framework. And I worry that DC's getting a little away from that. I think over the last decade, honestly, there were some really substantial reforms in tax, in regulatory structure, in just in housing growth, in development. There were a lot of things that made DC more attractive. I think there's been a reversal a little on the tax front, and also just the sort of discussions that have been happening in obviously discussions need to happen, but I have seen in some states, I've seen in California and in Washington state, where just the laundry list of the new taxes that might be coming, even if they never come, businesses are making investment for the long term. They don't want to move and then move again in 3 years. They're big investments. So there's always a risk when they see 40 different tax ideas, even if you look at them and say, 35 of those are just completely off the table. It feels like a drumbeat, and they say, I don't see this in Virginia. And that's a risk. So I think that sending a message that there are some limits here and that DC does care about being competitive, not being the lowest tax jurisdiction, but that DC cares about competition is really important for bringing businesses and individuals back downtown.
And there's some good ideas. I went through the district's latest 5-year economic development strategy, the DC comeback report. I looked at that last night, and there's some good ideas in there. It discusses innovation districts, where you have co-located university, entrepreneurship support, small business development assistance. There's a great example of that in Austin called Capital Factory. That's brought together UT Austin and the entrepreneurship community there. There's no reason why you couldn't target one of those strategies for adaptive reuse in one of these properties. So yeah, there's some good thinking already demonstrated, I think, in that current strategy.
That was on the Texas presentation. It was stated that workforce education was important, and that Texas is good, but relative to the cost. What is that? Could you explain that a little bit?
Of course. Yeah. So Texas doesn't spend very much on education if you compare to other states. We're at the bottom of spending, but we get outcomes that are at the middle of the distribution of the states on K through 12. So at least pre-pandemic. So we like to say, given what you spend on it, you're getting a pretty good return, in the sense you're spending less, at the bottom of the distribution. You're getting outcomes for the kids at the middle of the distribution, even though a lot of these kids come from, underrepresented groups. And so the performance is pretty good in terms of relative to what you're spending on it, but it's still not enough. And especially once you fast forward to higher education. So we really, only 60% of the kids that start higher ed actually finish within 6 years with some kind of degree or certificate. So, it gets to be a problem later on. And certainly there's not enough spending. And I don't know if you know this, but the Houston school district was just taken over by the state. So definitely there's issues there. But I just did want to point out that they run a pretty efficient shop, in the sense that they spend little and they get average returns. They spend less than average and get average performance by the kids on these standardized tests.
In the publicly supported institutions, I know in South Carolina, when BMW was coming in, there was a deal between the state and the publicly supported institutions to train the workforce. Similar things exist in Texas, and that's something the district could possibly think about.
Oh yeah, I'm so glad you raised that. So one place where Texas really stands out is with our community colleges. And so there's lots of interesting aspects of Texas community colleges, but one is the partnerships with the private sector, and some of those are better in some parts of the state than others, but there are some really amazing examples, especially around Corpus Christi, where they have a lot of the petroleum, the crackers where they make the plastics, and they have the refineries, and they really are very, it's like a fine-tuned machine, the coordination with the community college funneling, the students when they graduate into these industries. And these are high-paying, blue-collar jobs. And so it's they've done an amazing job. The other thing that they've done in Texas community colleges, and there was just a big reform to implement this more broadly, but it's to base funding on outcomes of students. And so what they're going to do is link and they already do this for Texas State Technical College, is they link funding for the community college to the increase in earnings that the students realize after they graduate, compared to when they started the community college. So this is a way to not micromanage the school, but then to really reward them to the extent that they're able to provide value added for the students, so they're able to graduate and actually make a higher income.
There's another program that's been very successful in Louisiana. So Louisiana's been really aggressive in using workforce training as an economic development tool. So they've got a program called Fast Start, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it's basically an arrangement that's worked out where if a company is going to locate or expand a facility in Louisiana, the state will basically take over their training on their behalf. They'll promise them time-certain credentials. That if there isn't an already existing credential program, they'll stand one up on behalf of the company and do highly customized training. You're outsourcing your entire training to be ready on day one when your facility is ready. And Louisiana's had a lot of success with that.
Eric, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, actually, it sort of picks up maybe on that last comment made. And I appreciate that there was some data brought with some comparisons of how people fare by race. I just wanted to see if you have more examples of places that have pursued economic development strategies that invest in sort of the communities that already exist in a place. So, I mean, I hear everybody saying we need to attract people, and I think that's important. But we're also, a district where Black poverty to white poverty is 4-to-1, where white households earn 2.5 times what Black households make, where Black unemployment is 6 to 7 times that of white workers. So these are we have a 10% unemployment rate for Black workers right now in the district, even though we have a much lower overall rate, a very low rate for white workers. So I just wonder, that to me strikes me as a lot of potential, untapped potential, kind of left on the table. A lot of people who aren't able to contribute fully to the economy and sort of build the demand we need for different kinds of goods and services. And so I just wonder what you've seen around, maybe if there are places in Texas that are advancing strategies that sort of target the folks that currently live in the place.
Great. Thanks, Erica. Brian, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So the most recent example I'd probably point to is not Texas, it's Columbus, Ohio. So the economic development group there it's called the Columbus Partnership, and their entire economic development strategy is structured around the idea of becoming the most prosperous place in the country. And they go to great lengths to define prosperity as broad-based prosperity and do a really good job of tracking metrics related to closing the gaps. They have everything from income disparity to geographical inequality in terms of where people can find living, family, wage jobs, looking at disparities in workers acquiring credentials, and they take a really rigorous approach and they're very serious about it. So that's one example I would point you to. But most communities these days, I mean, the vast majority of the ones we work with, equity is a strong component of the economic development strategy, and a lot of that is due to the federal funding in a lot of places that's used in combination with private funding to execute these strategies. So you can find good examples elsewhere, but Columbus is one that I would point you to.
Can you talk about the differences between tax incentives and tax competitiveness? There's been a lot of discussion about, do we want to lay out expenditures for attraction purposes or for economic activity purposes versus a rate that might be on par with our surrounding jurisdiction?
I could maybe speak to that a little. There is, I think, a significant risk in highly targeted incentives. If they are broad-based investment incentives, that is more trying to address some of the ways that the tax code, not just in DC, but in a lot of places, can be biased against investment, typically not intentionally. If it is workforce training, as was discussed, or more targeted programs like that that are about the workforce, these can make sense. When you get too targeted with incentives, when you start picking winners and losers a little too often, this creates a number of problems. Obviously, someone has to pay for that. Either you're just foregoing the revenue in a relatively inefficient way, or someone else is paying higher taxes than they would otherwise to pay for these targeted incentives, which frankly don't often pan out quite as much as might be hoped. And they tend to ossify the tax code around the industries and the industry goals of a particular moment in time. North Carolina is an interesting example here. Now, they've done a lot on taxes, but I'm going to focus on one piece, set aside a lot of the others. When they looked at tax reform about a decade ago, one thing they realized is they had pretty high rates. They had very low tax collections, and functionally it was because they had a tax code with massive incentives for tobacco, for textile manufacturing, and for a few other categories. If you were in that, you paid almost nothing. If you were in other fields, you paid quite a bit. So the Research Triangle, a lot of great ideas coming out of there, and they got spun off somewhere else, not in North Carolina, because it wasn't competitive for them. Now, North Carolina could have said, okay, we're going to get rid of the incentives for tobacco, and we're going to create new ones for tech. What they instead did is they actually leveled the playing field a little more. Everyone paid, on the business side, something a little more neutral. I think that is the right call, because even if you get it right, and you're not always going to get it right, if policymakers always knew which industries were
What's
going
that
to
called?
succeed,
It's,
you could make a whole lot of money elsewhere. But even if you get it right
trying to get
now,
in a Dropbox.
you
They
aren't going to necessarily get it right for 30 years from now, and tax codes get locked in for a long period of time. So focus on workforce development, sure. Focus on broad-based, goals of inducing investment. But I would encourage you not to do highly targeted incentives, especially if you're throwing a ton of money after a
61.
couple of businesses.
Uh-huh.
Can I suggest folks on the phone, can you mute your line?
621365.
Yes.
Tony, can you mute your line? There you go. Pia, do you want to add anything into on the Texas experience with broad tax competition versus the use of targeted incentives? And then I see Yeshim has a question. Do you want me to?
Being from the Fed, I probably don't want to talk about tax incentives, but I do, just generally, I think the research supports to, competitiveness is more about having a broad, comprehensive tax base that's not too far out of line, with surrounding areas. I think that's got to be the best long run strategy. Avoid, uncertainty and surprises, and provide that kind of sense of certainty around the business climate, couple tax with regulation, other, things that firms find conducive to growth and expansion. And I think that's the secret, because I think what Jared said it very well about some of the problems that can happen with incentives.
So I don't want to weigh in on that, because I get in trouble with my EY attorneys. So this is not tax advice coming from Ernst & Young. I am going to make a point about city management, though, and working over planning and development services in two different places. Predictability in the development process can go a really long way, and a lot of the conversations and a lot of the just development-related issues we had in both of those cities could have been solved talking kind of less about tax incentives and more about how to improve the development services pipeline process. So don't neglect one in favor of the other, because they're both important.
And I think something like that along the lines of a downtown, I hate the terms that are often used, czars or whatever. But if we are really trying to resuscitate downtown and give it a different world, it'd be interesting to have, an office or a person whose sole responsibility is that whole planning and thinking, everything. If you're going to bring 15,000 people, kids, residents, where will the children go to school and so on? It has to be more than just a one-off. But I do think, I'm worried about these notes coming due and buildings being turned back in a spiral that will take us 2 decades to get out from under. All because, we want to spend today and not save today.
If I could make two other really quick points about incentives. One, eligibility for them and ability to actually pursue and obtain them tends to skew towards much larger businesses, which that's not bad. I mean, you want large businesses to come and invest, but that means your smaller businesses, often that may be minority-owned businesses in DC, are going to have a harder time getting them, especially if they're not broad-based incentives. If they are more targeted, they're going to have more trouble with that. So there's a tax equity issue, beyond anything else there, and I think that's not ideal. The other aspect of this is you have to decide, where do you want to influence markets? And obviously, cities and states and jurisdictions to override just the market, and they want to say, we care about the equity provision, we care about providing this social service, and that's all great and fine. But an area you probably don't want to interfere too much in is the capital investment decisions. Do we want as a business to invest in X or Y should be driven really by profitability and by business decisions if you want to have growth, not by an incentive that was created 10 years ago that favors X investment and not Y investment. Those are areas where I don't think anyone is really benefiting. So again, everyone has incentives. I'm not saying get rid of them all, but I wouldn't build an economic development strategy around them.
Thanks, Jared. Nestor, you have your hand up.
Thank you. I have a question for Jared and another one for Pia. So DC is not the only city experiencing these negative impacts from COVID. It's happening everywhere, in especially large and high-cost metro areas and employment centers. Jared, what have you been seeing in locations like DC in terms of tax policy that they might be considering given the new economic reality? Are any of these states or cities using different approaches to their tax policy to counter or kind of lift themselves up? And Pia, on the other hand, as focused on Texas, a state that has experienced tremendous growth, do you see any shifts in the states or localities' approach to tax policies there? Thank you.
It's a great question. And honestly, to your point, a lot of cities are struggling with this. Hybrid work makes it a lot easier to live outside the city. It makes it easier for businesses, frankly, to locate elsewhere as well, because they don't have to have their entire workforce right there. I don't know if you can hear me. Can someone indicate? I think we lost connection. Okay, good. You can hear me. So, it makes it easier for a location of the business itself to be outside of the city center too, because they can have a workforce across the country. We have seen, I think, a lot of focus on tax competition in states and cities, in part because of this. The COVID crisis has changed the pace of tax competition. 24 states have cut individual income taxes since the start of the pandemic. 13 states have cut corporate income taxes. There have been big changes on the treatment of capital investment. Some of this would have happened anyway. A lot of it, I do think, is happening because jurisdictions realize that this competition is much more salient than it used to be, that if you are an outlier, it is far easier to vote with your feet than it used to be. There aren't easy solutions, and DC is not going to have lower taxes than Virginia, and that's not the point. The question is just, what's the wedge? There are advantages to being downtown, but what is that tax wedge? And right now, unfortunately, especially with a lot of somewhat vacant properties, the capital investment that it'll take to convert them in some ways is more expensive in DC than elsewhere. I would focus on that. And I have no idea if anyone who's not virtual heard any of that.
No, we
No, we
heard
did.
it.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
In Texas, the preoccupation, and it's not totally unrelated to the work from home phenomenon, in the sense that work from home is part of the reason that we saw this big surge in migration to Texas, and then the big surge in home buying and bigger homes also, because all the fiscal stimulus and all the monetary stimulus with the zero interest rates and so forth. So all this led to a collision course with the property tax, which is one of the main underpinnings of our tax system here. And so, and now, of course, the preoccupation with trying to pass a property tax cut. So that's not unrelated to work from home, because everybody's working from home and they need a bigger house when they're working from home, and it's, further away from the office. So we're dealing with a lot of the same issues, that you're dealing with in DC. I don't think that this trend is going to reverse itself completely. I mean, we spent, I think, 8% of our weeks working from home or working remotely before the pandemic. It went as high as almost 40% during the pandemic, and I think it's down to about 30% right now. So it may come down a little bit more, but I think it's a phenomenon that's here to stay. There has been talk here in Dallas, certainly, about subsidizing these conversions of office buildings to residential, to multifamily apartments. But of course, the problem there is that I think something like less than 10% of office buildings are really, it's possible to do that with them, and the cost, could be recouped within a finite time period. So it really is not going to be a broad, solution to the problem we're facing in commercial real estate.
If you're interested in that topic too, there's I think some of this made its way actually into the district's economic development strategy, but there's a great recent, very short, very readable paper from Brookings on sort of the what's real, maybe what's more myth on residential conversions of office that I would highly recommend.
Yes, a Brookings study?
Yes, sir.
One by Tracy had enough.
Yes.
Yeah. Let me ask one final question, and then we will move to the part of the discussion. And the speakers are welcome to stick around, but interested in hearing what commissioners are taking from this discussion. To following up on I guess Yeshin's question about sort of what are places doing about this in response to the trend to work. Jared, you mentioned tax competition. Of course, here in the district, we have a property tax, we have commercial property tax, we have a separate rate for residential property tax, we have a corporate tax, we have an income tax, we have a sales tax. So we've got a number of potential tools which we could use. I don't think we have a lot of clarity of sort of which is the right tool for this circumstance. And I realize this might involve a level of analysis I'm kind of asking you to do off the cuff. But are you seeing any patterns in terms of what tools you're using? So for instance, are the cities in Texas, because I know cities in Texas are facing a lot of them are facing pretty substantial vacancy rates at all. Is the discussion about property tax aimed in part at getting the commercial rate down, or is that more aimed at residential rates? And then, maybe to Jared, sort of, given that, how do you think about the different taxes in terms of tax competition? Go ahead, Pia.
Yeah, Nick, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. This corporate tax cut bill has cuts the exemption, increases the exemption, the homestead exemption, but it also addresses, second homes and commercial property as well. And so I don't remember exactly the details, but definitely that the governor had, I don't remember who insisted that it would be there, but it's addressing both, homeowners and commercial properties. So there's something in there for both.
But what factors they use in a calculation of reducing income tax? Not the property tax. How do you make that determination? You're going to reduce the property tax. What indicators do you use to come up with that formula? How do you do that?
They focus primarily on increasing the exemption rather than lowering the rate. So they by increasing the exemption, then you get these immediate savings. Of course, you'll grow out of those. So I think what they did for the commercial properties is they actually put a cap on appreciation. So so I don't know if Jared's around. You want to speak to that, Jared? Because you have to be careful with those caps on appreciation, right? Because doesn't California have something like that? Is that Prop 13?
Yes.
Right.
Disaster.
Yeah,
Disaster.
that's correct. And can I maybe say, please don't lean into that model. There's different ways that you can restrict the growth of property taxes, and in some jurisdictions, it makes sense to have that. Across the country, we've seen on average an appreciation of 40% in residential property value. And even when you account for inflation, it seems unlikely that anyone is getting 40% better services, or the government, it doesn't really make sense that your taxes would go up 40%. That probably should be rolled back in most jurisdictions. At the same time, you want this to be pegged in some way to the real value of your property. If property values went up 40%, but mine went up 80% and yours went up nothing, I should still be paying more than you. If we have properties across the street from each other and I bought this year and you bought 20 years ago, I shouldn't be picking up a much larger burden. This is actually really inequitable for a lot of reasons. It creates a lock-in effect, meaning that individuals who maybe are ready to downsize don't, and therefore there's less, there are fewer locations available for people. There's just a market change. It means that younger, often lower income individuals can't afford to enter the property market or pay much higher property taxes in terms of effective rates than longtime incumbent homeowners. So, I mean, particularly in DC, there's going to be a racial component of that longtime white homeowners would be paying much less under an assessment limit. These are not good things. These are all avoidable. There is something called a levy limit, which is basically just a rollback of the millage, the rate for everyone across the board in the jurisdiction based on growth. So let's say you build in a growth factor. You say that you want to account for inflation plus X% growth, but 40% increase is probably well above whatever you set. So let's say you did inflation plus 3%, and you end up rolling back 30% roughly, and over the course of 3 years, not 1 year, but like that accumulated amount. So you're still paying based on your actual property value. That is your baseline, but the rate's gone down to reflect that, and it can go back up if the property value is declined. That is a better approach. I would encourage you not to break that linkage between the assessed value of a property and what you pay in property taxes. Very inequitable, means fewer conversions, less growth, and much more inefficient use of property.
On the commercial side in Texas, so just speaking from kind of the local economic developer perspective, there's two tools in your toolkit. And I don't know what's permissible here in the district, but you can do abatements and you can also do refunds on the property tax side. And in Texas, for cities, property taxes make up usually on average about 40%.
Commercial?
Yes, or industrial on the revenue sides. And then Texas also, so sales tax is usually, and Jared can correct me if I'm wrong here, but in most cities, it's roughly 25% of your local revenue. And you can do the same thing there under Texas law. You can do refunds of sales tax collections, and you can do some other creative things as well. And Tennessee, it's pilots, so it's payment in lieu of taxes. So that's just how they structure their property tax incentive for economic development.
Jerry, just one last question about, we have a regional transit system. I don't know if any of these jurisdictions have similar or what the level of development is, how sophisticated they are, but we have a regional one where the costs are about evenly divided between the district and Maryland, and then Virginia pays less. So it's like 40, 40, 20 or something around those. What tax, aside from, because we're going to see some movement in the region to pay for belt tightening that WMATA refuses to do. All right, let's be honest. We have a transit system that depends on people coming to work, and they only ask their workers to come to work 3 days a week. Does anyone see the stupidity in the transit system who's dependent on people coming to work, not making their own people come to work, not engaging in any real significant cost cutting? This is to you, Mr. CFO, just because I know you're at the table. But in any event, they're going to go do nothing to square their own accounts, and they're going to ask us all to chip in. Having said that, what type of tax is best suited to support a regional transit? Not the first available, not the easiest. What is the smartest tax from an economic perspective, an economic development perspective? Who should pay for that service?
Probably probably shouldn't weigh in on this, but I will.
I'm sincerely interested. I
So,
just
so
don't know.
should, I want to be careful about
It's not attributed to your employee.
what's the best way to do this?
Yeah.
In Texas, it's done primarily through local option sales tax.
What is that?
So now, so under Texas law, right, so in the state portion of the sales tax is 6 1/4.
Okay.
And the legislature has allowed cities to go up another 2 cents. And you can divide that up in increments, 1/2 cent, whole cent. And in some regions, like Boston's a good example, DFW is another example with the DART system. You can take, let's say we're gonna go to the voters and we're gonna pass a referendum in order to pay into the transit system through the sales tax. If the voters agree to it, you can elect 1/2 cent and you can contribute that to development of transit. And the thinking there, at least the way that it's sold in a lot of places, is transit is going to have an effect on corridor development. And around the nodes where stations are, obviously, but then also along the corridor. So that's the philosophical. You can debate on whether or not it happens or when it happens, but that's usually the mechanism through which it's done. We tried the same. So I was in Nashville and we tried to pass a $6 billion transit initiative there. Same deal. The difference there, though, is in Texas, that I don't believe the legislature has on their radar any ability to allow cities to surpass that total 8 1/4 rate. There's a hard cap.
Okay.
Tennessee, politics were in a little different place back then, and the governor allowed Nashville, basically struck an exception agreement and said, Nashville could go beyond their cap in order to fund this transit referendum if it passed. So maybe somebody else can better address the should or smartest component, but that's how it's done in other places.
Pia or Jared, do you want to give anything added? Pia saying no.
She's smarter than I am, obviously.
I don't have a lot to say on that. I think he's right that sales taxes have been the primary way outside of revenue that's directly generated by the system, for transit and transportation generally, partially again on that theory that at least you're capturing those who are using it indirectly because they're coming into the city, and the sales tax is generally a more economically efficient tax. But it's obviously a challenge. You would like ideally for much of that to be borne by fares, but then you get issues. I should perhaps be paying more than when I use Metro, but you want to make sure that others are capable of using the system, so you run into that challenge.
Thanks, Jared.
Excellent.
I wrote the Silver Line in for the first time, actually, when I got here, and so congratulations on having that open.
It's not paid for.
So thank you. I want to thank you again, Jared, Pia, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us here. It's really been a great conversation, and you guys have provided a really diverse range of perspectives, and we appreciated them. And most likely, we'd love to be able to stay in touch, because I'm sure there will be things where people are like, oh yeah, I thought of another question I wanted to ask. You guys have been very generous with your time already. Unless there's any other questions, I want to close out this part of the conversation and open it up to commissioners. If you have, it's not required, but if you have thoughts, observations, directions you think that this discussion takes us, now would be a great time to share those.
Chris, Lee knows that, well, we all know, this is going to be on commercial buildings, the tax is based upon the value of the building. And there's a big discussion now, the building going to have tenants, less income, less valuation, this will get less income. And we shift that to residential property, which seems to be going up in value and not decreasing. The homeowner is paying more here, and it's on an asset that doesn't produce income. The argument for the office building produces income. The residential does not produce any income, and as the value goes up, the resident pays more. And the question is, is there any way to try to get some tax neutrality in it to address that kind of issue where the homeowner is not burdened as much as the property value goes up, because it doesn't produce any income, and his income is largely fixed there, but his cost is just going up. That's kind of, I mean, maybe that's more philosophical kind of question, but I don't know.
I agree. Look, I think the way we've structured property taxes, in my view, I think a homestead deduction that provides relief, especially for lower income people, makes a lot of sense, but I also believe it should apply to everyone. I don't believe in creating two-tier tax systems that apply differently depending on what the flavor of the month is ideologically. So I would favor an increase in the property tax in the homestead exemption, and looking at if we're going to squeeze things and move it around for neutrality purposes, I look to reduce deed and recordation taxes.
Yes.
Particularly because I look at all the ways in which this city, through its good intentions, has conspired to facilitate the disparities in income that exist. If you can't afford a house, you can't develop wealth. And if we have high taxation right out of the gate, you're done. A city that takes 25% more in taxes than our surrounding jurisdictions, that has its impact on wealth creation, because the government has taken your money and you can't save it. And then the government turns around and says, look at this huge wealth disparity. Well, the government's the bank robber. We're spending twice, state and local combined, than any other jurisdiction in the country. And for our investment, we're getting half of what we're investing. So I think we need to look at what we have done as a state, as a jurisdiction, to hinder wealth creation. I would look at deed or recordation. I'm fine if we want to have, however we want to make it easier for people to own a home. And if that means some have to pay more, I'm all right with that, I guess.
And I think David's point is well taken when it comes to people of color, particularly African Americans, in terms of passing wealth there from one generation to the other. It becomes a issue of affordability. Yeah.
The people can't stay in that, their income is not going up.
Right.
But their taxes are going up. And that's a problem. I mean, we have to go to look at homestead exemptions or some basis to level that out.
Can't afford it. Can't afford it, yeah.
Folks on
Yeah.
the screen.
Can I jump in?
Back to that point, which is, in most instances, real estate taxes, based upon some valuation. And I probably have a little argument about it with on income producing property. But conceptually, raising the tax on non-income producing property because of the value has gone up. That conceptually is difficult for me to wrap around.
Yeah, I think.
Mr. Mayor, you've been there, you raised taxes. What do you think?
You're on mute, man.
Saying collected taxes or raised taxes?
Kind of both.
It's funny, the council raising taxes.
I think, from my point of view, we've been down the road with expenditures. It's a huge area of opportunity for the district to really dig in and see what's happening. We spend a lot of money. Two, I would disagree. I think that tax incentives are a complement. They're not a substitute, but they can be a powerful complement. Not all cities are the same. In the district, with NOMA, with the Southwest waterfront, and other areas where expectations were good and rising, and we had tax incentives, they worked beautifully. So it really is on a case-by-case basis. But I would agree with our presenters that they're not a substitute for good, competitive policies. And thirdly, I think a big area is in the area of we spend a lot of money. We spend a lot of money on education. There's an overlap between, you know, K through university education and readiness of the workforce, but it's not all of it. And he kind of hinted at it, the big investment that some states are making, like Louisiana, to train a workforce ready for employment. A lot of people think we ought to be continue to spend the time we're spending, I would say with more alacrity and urgency on improving K to 12 education, but got to spend more time on really, and this gets back to expenditures. We spend a lot of money on job training. We're top in the country. Why aren't we best in class in terms of a ready workforce? Those are my takeaways.
I agree.
Eric, I think you were trying to jump in.
Yeah. I mean, on the spending question, I think a caveat to the data that we saw earlier is that it's not really apples to compare DC to census data on the cities or on the state and local combined. The state and local combined would include all localities, and so then you're spreading that cost from the big cities around. So it's just I don't doubt that we're at the top of we invest a lot. We are a place that values public investment in communities and people. But I don't think that those numbers are like apples to apples kind of comparison. So I would just caveat that. I think my takeaways, I appreciated some of the nuanced conversation about competitiveness and what all the different factors at play are. I agree, like there's the workforce element. I mean, we have like 28% of young people 16 to 24 who are neither young Black people who are 16 to 24 who are not working or in school. So we have like a real disconnected youth issue here in DC that I think is a big issue, and we you can't really expect good outcomes from people over their life trajectories if they're not getting a good start from the outset as they enter the workforce or try to. I also think that one of the things I heard was like broad base and a broad-based tax system. So I think some of the things we've been talking about to try and spread, to try and capture more taxpayers in our system, given our limitations, is really important. And I do think we're talking, like some of the things I heard folks saying around, what we're doing for sort of smaller businesses and some of the ability to comply, like the compliance issues and some of those things. We have been talking about those, so it was, I think, good to hear that reaffirmed.
Thank you.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah, well, let me just say, we could go on, but I want to make sure, I don't know if Yesham or Jody, I think we lost Rashad.
Yeah, I just want to add a little bit more. I mean, listening to these and thinking about what's happening in DC, my mind keeps going to, as the Tax Revision Commission, one of the things that to me is important as a member is figuring out what parts of our economy will perform strongly, what could be our next workhorse when it comes to raising revenues. That's not to say that we can look at our spending side, we should be looking at it. But right now, the district's revenue base, like the commercial office buildings, are an important part of our revenue raising strategy. So is individual income taxes. So our residential property taxes. I think the question that we should be thinking about is looking at the next 5-10 years, is this current allocation of how much we rely on growth in a certain tax base, is it correct? It seems to me, for example, the commercial property tax base is not going to grow strongly in the next 5 years. So we're gonna have to shift burdens from there to somewhere else. And how do we do that while keeping the city competitive? To me, is the really, really important question. I just wanted to raise that because I think we've been thinking about, considering different policies and different goals, racial equity, competitiveness, simplicity, broaden the base, whatnot. But it'll be great to sort of like have a bigger, take a step back and think about what are we betting on as we kind of think of new tax policy. We have to be betting on growth in some tax base, and what is that? I'll stop here.
Great question.
Can I just say to Pia, I liked her discussion about industry cluster. And, if you look at our two big industries are, at this point, aside from hospitality, let's say it would be education and the federal government. And the federal government can't hire enough people, and, we haven't exactly tailored our community college to become a pipeline to the federal government. I don't know how often we would sit down with OMB and say, what are your next 10
Amen, amen.
what are your next 10 years of hiring look like, and how do we create associate and bachelor's degrees to fill those? And I mean, it could be built right down to our high schools, to be honest. And people would laugh at it, but these are very good jobs, and I don't care if we create a pipeline for the federal bureaucracy. Why would we be ashamed of that? That seems to be infinitely sensible. But the second issue is, and I've been, I'm sorry Rashad isn't here to see, because I've been messing around with these universities, and they're paying their share. And certainly, Jim and I have been talking about this. If you can't beat them, join them. Maybe you look at some of this empty downtown space, and you look at, loosening our campus plan, because our campus plans serve as an artificial barrier to the growth of what is one of our fastest industries. They can't grow outside of those boundaries without a hook and bullet crew and a neighborhood fist fight. And so I think downtown presents an interesting opportunity for satellite campuses for some of our fastest growing employers, or organizations, universities, and find a way to incentivize their looking at these buildings and figuring out a way to how it could make sense for them, and how we could facilitate that through our efforts here. By God forbid, extending additional privileges to the already privileged, but they are an engine of talent. Just a thought.
All right. Thank you all very much again. We lost Jared, but Pia and Brian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, commissioners. We are back here next Tuesday. You'll get another email with another batch of proposals in the next few days. And I look forward to that conversation. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Brian and Pia.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah.